We commend it to the House.
Mr. Speaker. Struth.
I call the honourable member David Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd just like to thank all members of the House, which the way that they've approached this bill. I think, first of all, I'd like to thank my colleagues from the National Party that have dealt with the issues on the ground in Christchurch, and we've got a number in the House tonight that have led the way for their region. And through the leadership of the Honourable Jerry Brownlee, the National Party and the government has delivered for the people of Christchurch. And on the other side of the House, we have a number of members also from Christchurch who have been very diligent in advocating for their issues in their areas as well. And the way that they're contributing to this bill tonight, I think, shows their interest and their desire to make sure we get the best result for Christchurch that we can. And so in the end, I think everybody around the country actually has seen the need and desires to support Christchurch at this time, and we wish everyone the best on Sunday in that fundraising effort to do that. This bill is something that shouldn't take long to go through this House, but doesn't take away the magnitude of what we are doing here. This represents a time when New Zealanders come together and to support fellow New Zealanders in a time of need, and it is something that we need to do in this House from time to time, and represents the role of government. So it does have some technical taxation elements to it that relate to areas such as the effect of contributions on the family scheme income, redundancy payment tax credit, and the donated trading stock, and welfare contributions by employers to employees. In the end, this is a bill which is in the best interest of Canterburyans. It shows the support this Parliament can do for all New Zealanders at this time through the budget, and we support this bill through the House.
Speaker. I call the honourable member Brendan Burns.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to continue the bipartisan spirit that has been displayed by this House, and I think it is truly appropriate. I'd like to thank my colleague Stuart Nash for his fulsome acknowledgement of the role that I played, but I think that I would also like to acknowledge all of the Canterbury MPs on both sides of the House and our Green colleague Ken Graham for the work that they have done, and Rahui Kātani too, on behalf of the Titai Tonga electorate and the Māori community in Christchurch. I think that we have served our communities well through what has been the most extraordinary difficult time, and of course we are not out of the woods yet. Obviously, the winter is upon us, and that will present its own challenges to us as a city. But I think that the Parliament has shown that at times like this, we can come together in the best interests of our communities. And just an example, picking up on the comments of the member for Hamilton East,
Very active member
just on Monday night, there was a photo exhibition opened in Hamilton of photographs by Fairfax photographers, including some from the Waikato Times who came down to cover the enormous events of February 22 and its aftermath. One of those photographers was a chap called Chris Hillock, a very fine and award-winning photographer for the Waikato Times, and his mother Maggie Hillock, who happens to be my campaign manager, suggested the idea of a photo exhibition which was backed by the Waikato Times, by Fairfax, and again in that bipartisan spirit I note that even though it was organised, or suggested at least, by a Labour member and organised by the former MP for Christchurch East, when I saw the photograph appear, it was of the MP for Hamilton West in the photograph at that exhibition. So that's a good example of that bipartisan spirit which is serving Canterbury well at this time. And of course over the weekend we are seeing a huge global telethon supported by Māori television, again to raise funds for our city and region in the wake of the enormous disaster of February 22. So this bill is obviously a measure which simply assists in respect of donations that have been made by employers to employees in the wake of the quakes, so those donations are not affecting the eligibility for working for families and other benefits. There are the amount that Working for Families pays in the Canterbury region is of the order of $300 million a year, and we're very, very welcoming of those payments. And of course they are enormously important to some of the more beleaguered communities, if you like, because although they did spread across the income spectrum, some of those who are really most benefited by Working for Families are in some of the hard-hit eastern suburbs of Christchurch, including parts of my electorate in Avonside and Richmond. So this bill, which means that they won't have their eligibility for Working for Families payments affected by payments that employers might have given in the wake of February 22, is very welcome. I'd also like to acknowledge the extraordinary outpouring of donations from the business community in the wake of February 22. I made it a practice on an almost daily basis from about day 3 or 4 in to go to Civil Defence headquarters, open the boot of my red Beetle and fill it with goods that have been donated by companies the length and breadth of New Zealand, and in fact probably broader. I know that amongst the consignments that I put into my boot was Australian-made banana boat sun cream, and it was very, very welcome. The weather was still hot. People obviously were sometimes choosing to spend a lot of time outdoors because of the damage to their homes and businesses. So that was amongst the goods that I took on a daily basis to community groups, to trusts and organisations that were helping people. There were torches that had been donated, there were batteries, there was water by the pallet load, because obviously we lost potable water for some days after the quake in large parts of the city. There was fly spray, which was quite useful for some households. And there were a great quantity of rubber gloves and face masks, and I have to confess that I've still got some rubber gloves and face masks in the garage at home, and I'm hoping that they might come in useful at some other point. I didn't quite know who to give them back to once the need had passed, but I guess they might come in to some use later in the year if we get any outbreak of flu or anything similar. So those things were donated generously by businesses across New Zealand, and this bill in part is making sure that they're not going to have to pay tax on those goods that they've donated to people affected by the quake. And I just think that's another indication of the national response. We have felt enormously heartened, and it goes on, as I mentioned, the photo exhibition as recently as Monday night of this week launched an appeal raising funds for the people of Canterbury. This weekend, Māori television with global support, and I acknowledge the role that Fonterra is playing in that. Thinking of comments in a previous bill in the House earlier in the day from our colleague from Taranaki King Country, I will acknowledge the role that Fonterra is playing in supporting that enormous fund-raising initiative. The only disquiet, I guess, I'd like to express about the bill is timing, because as we've seen, there was a regulatory impact statement prepared by IRD officials. I note that they concluded that and submitted it to the Cabinet on the 17th of March, St Patrick's Day, if you like, 3 weeks after the quake, and yet the bill was introduced on the 4th of May, some 7 weeks later. I'd suggest that lead time gives an indication that that might have provided the opportunity that we prefer in this House, so we can actually scrutinise legislation. With all due respect to officials, things can often be picked up by the combined intelligence of the Select Committee process and public inputs to that, and that's really the best way through. And there is a bit of a pattern here emerging. I noted that a Canterbury Ram should be a sheep or a sports team. It should not be a government habit in respect of legislation introduced to the House. And of course we've had quite... I'm not going to pick up, despite the temptation, and despite some members from rural electorates across the way, to pick up on the analogies that my colleague, the member for Makariri, is starting to develop in respect of sheep analogy. But I would just make the point, again, trying to respect what I think is the bipartisan nature of this bill, to government, that where is it at all possible? And there should only be compelling circumstances where legislation is not subject to the scrutiny of a select committee, because it does truly add to our knowledge. It does add to the rigour of the bill, and it means that we avoid two things. One, it avoids the prospect of the Parliament having to come back to a piece of legislation because it has been pushed through under urgency without any consideration. That's the process. That's what we should be following. And secondly, it also means that that the fishhooks can be picked up there and then. So those are the benefits of the select committee process. But as we've made clear, we are keen to see this piece of legislation. We are keen to see the Taxation Canterbury Earthquake Measures Bill. We are supporting it through its stages. We have some concerns about the urgency that's being applied, but it is a bill which makes absolute sense to Canterbury at this time. And we are still very much a community in need. We acknowledge that other budget measures have provided the funding that are there to pay for 60% of the restoration of Canterbury's infrastructure. That's come through in earlier legislation from the budget. This is an accompanying measure, if you like. We are still nowhere near out of the woods in respect of the challenges we face as a community, as a city and province. And we will need every ongoing effort. And one of the things that I think we need to accord, if we're going to use urgency, let's use urgency to connect it to the rebuild of Christchurch. And my colleague Stuart Nash mentioned the Napier example, and my final comment and note, Napier rebuilt its CBD in 2 years flat. 2 years flat from absolute desolation. Everything was razed by the fire that followed the quake. They had an interim tin town where the commercial businesses were able to operate. A fantastic initiative. More building was done in Napier in those 2 years than the whole of the rest of New Zealand. We need a sense of urgency, not in the sense of this bill being pushed through the House under urgency, but the rebuild of Christchurch needs that. I ask members to give their support to that urgency in respect of Christchurch's future.
Speaker.